All right, I think we are getting started. We're live. Hello to everyone that is tuning in. I'm going to give a couple of minutes for people to just, jump in here. Hopefully, we've got some folks that will be coming in maybe a couple of minutes late. I see some people typing. Nice to see everyone. So, my name is Melissa. I'm on our customer experience team here at Designlab. And obviously, I'm joined by Oliver, the star, the spotlight of today's event. Just for some just ground rules and just saying hello. I see everyone already saying hello in the chat, so thank you so much. Love to know where you guys are tuning in from. I'm personally in Medellin, Colombia, so would love to hear what cities everyone is in the chat. I see some New York, I see some Atlanta, some Boston. Very cool. So as we get started, we're going to go through some questions today, of course, talking about Oliver's journey in UX Academy and thereafter, and even, the things leading up to the UX Academy journey. We've got on the bottom a questions tab. So as we're going, if you have any questions, make sure you leave them in that questions tab so that they don't get lost in the chat. And I'll try to take some time to throw those questions into our conversation. But yeah, I see, lots of locations, lots of people tuning in. Do you want to take a moment and say hello to everyone, Oliver?
Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome. I see a few New York City people. So I used to live in the Bronx, so shout out to my New York City folks out there.
I don't see anyone that's also in Colombia, but shout out to potentially anyone that's Colombian or that is ever been to Colombia. So I guess I will go ahead and get started. Thank you again for being with us, Oliver, and everyone in the chat. So Oliver, tell us a little bit about what led to you, taking a course with Designlab, and what was your background sort of getting into the courses?
Yeah, it was kind of unintentional. It just kind of happened. So I originally worked my background when I worked in New York City. Again, shout out to New York City people in the chat. I worked at a radio station called Breakthrough Radio and a magazine called Frank 151. And my New York City people might know Frank 151 as those like tiny magazines that look like a zine. So I used to work for those guys. So then I went to school in Montana. So I went from New York City to Montana and ended up in Oregon and was looking for another creative role. And so first thing that came to my mind was like, oh, marketing is really creative. So I worked for a marketing agency in a tech startup, and I did find some creativity in marketing, but generally in marketing, in my experience, once you find like the thing that works, you kind of have a tendency to use it until it's kind of run into the ground or it's just not performing well. So I ended up getting pulled one day into our website redesign. I had already done some design for templates and landing pages, but nothing as like big or as complex as a multi-million-dollar marketing website. So I kind of stumbled into it, and the web designer was like, so have you ever used this pretty cool app? And a few of you here might know about it. It's called Figma. I don't know if anyone knows. I got pulled into Figma, and I was immediately just like, I just loved designing the website. I loved using Figma. And it all just made sense. So especially with a creative background, one of the hardest parts about creative work is, especially with graphic design for me, was that the parameters of what you're designing are pretty ambiguous. You can kind of just keep going and going. And so with website design, with UX, UI, you could kind of, for me, I could define my creative boundaries and then work in them. And it just made that creative work so much easier for me. So that's kind of the long story of how I got to where I am. But yeah, eventually I found Designlab. I was like, this is the direction I'm going in. And then, one thing led to another.
I guess the very underground application known as Figma.
Yep.
Yeah, so it sounds like your background sort of lent itself to you getting an understanding of sort of the tools you would use and what UX UI might look like, maybe even before you realized that it could lead into UX UI. But when you found out about Designlab, why did you end up signing up for UX Academy over maybe other options or, other courses?
I would like to say like I did a bunch of research. I definitely didn't. My research was I looked at other sort of boot camps in a similar nature, and it kind of blows my mind of how many of these boot camps have really awful websites. Designlab was like one of the only ones that had like a good website, a nice brand. It was like welcoming and easy to navigate. That pretty much sold me. And I think too, I saw the uh, where some of the mentors came from. I know I saw Airbnb, Microsoft, other pretty big names in the industry. So that was also really important to me too, that you can have great coursework, but having that insight from someone who's been in the field for a long time, that's, I would argue, maybe slightly more valuable.
Yeah. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I specifically work with our mentors. So I could not agree more. I feel like it's definitely a highlight of the course. As with, I think it's important that a boot camp in UX UI has good UX UI. So it also makes sense that would, lend itself to being attractive when you were, trying to figure out your journey. Were you, because I was reading some of your background, how did your employer play into your decision, and how were you able to sort of pivot, maybe with support from your employer at the time?
Yeah. So I worked for an educational technology company. It's kind of weirdly hard to say. It was a tech startup. And so being an ed tech company, kind of have to put your money where your mouth is and say, we're also willing to invest in the education of our own employees. So we had a professional development fund that I think you get a percentage of like your salary, or I don't need to get in the details, but it was pretty soon after the website redesign that I talked to my manager and said, hey, there's this, it's the academy before like you get into like the more long form course. I forget what that's called. Is it just UX Academy or something like that?
So the UI course, UX Academy Foundations, and then into UX
Foundations.
Academy. Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah. So I showed her foundations. I basically said, listen, like I design a lot of stuff now. We want to have great user experience for our, prospective people, being that we're in marketing. And this is a great way to improve, the sort of turnaround we have with people who've never heard about Open Sesame before. So this money that is invested in me can also be turned around and make money for the company that we work for too.
So given that your time and skill building going into UX Academy, you had some experience with marketing and with using those skills in Figma and getting to know some software. What would your advice be for anyone that's watching that doesn't have or didn't have any previous design experience upon coming in? What would your advice be for going into UX Academy, but also just into UX UI as a field in general?
Yeah, that's a tough question. There's a lot of things I would say. So if one of the things that really helped me get a job in UX UI was having a marketing background and having that previous experience to say, okay, I've redesigned email templates, I've redesigned landing pages, I redesigned our marketing website twice over. That really helped me get a job, the current role I have right now. So with that being said, I think it's important to look back at what you have and see how you can apply your previous work towards, essentially like a recruiter. How can you, if you're like a history teacher, how can you take a history teacher's experience and pivot it to lean towards someone who is looking for someone who has design experience? And so I don't know what that would be, but like designing a lesson plan based on the students or the demographic you have is a great example of understanding the audience you have and catering to them. And that's a big part. So I'd say it's important to make sure you can translate your previous experience into something that is design, that is sort of catered to people who are looking for design experience. And as for tools, Figma's cool. I like Figma, and it's pretty user friendly. So just play around with Figma, get to know it. There's a lot of different ways to do design challenges for yourself. Join sort of volunteer sprints on designing things out, and that's a great way to get like hands-on experience to show like you can make a nice high fidelity mock-up for someone.
Yeah, I think it's for folks that don't have that previous design experience. I think keeping an eye out for where your experience does play in, and it might not play, like you said, directly into like you have experience doing high fidelity mockups, but it might play, in other ways, be it in the research phase or be it just in the way that you approach thinking about design.
Mm.
Yeah, I think keeping that like open mind to figuring out how you can translate that experience is helpful. Sometimes I'll talk to students who feel like because they don't have that previous design experience, they're almost shut off as if they're like starting new, like they're completely starting a new career, which they are. But I think it's good to keep that open mind about like where your previous experiences, can be pulled in, and not just for like your resume, but literally, they have prepared you for the things that you'll be doing, in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So to jump into your actual experience in UX Academy, what was your experience like? What was your favorite part? And maybe, what was something that you struggled with?
Yeah. So what was my experience like? It was good. I feel like if it was bad, I wouldn't be here. But so I'd say one of my favorite things about doing UX Academy was working with the mentors I had. So the first mentor I had in UX Academy was just like an invaluable part of my process. I think being able to give constructive criticism is difficult, uh, both to be able to say what you're trying to convey, but also having the person on the other end who's taken a lot of time and effort to design something out that they like, to make them feel like what they've done, you can see it and you understand it, and you can also see where it's improved or where it can be improved. So I had a mentor who was really, really good at doing that, and it actually encouraged me further to like make my designs even. I have a really high standard for my own work, but when you have someone who is reading your work really fast and giving feedback to just improve even further, it's nothing but encouraging. So it also feels like you're not alone in what you're trying to do. So that was definitely my favorite part. I always looked forward to talking to Bob and seeing what he has to say, and then just learning. And in those sessions I just learned a ton. And plus we really connected on video games, so we'd always talk about video games at the end of if the meeting was like an hour long, it'd be like 15 minutes of talking about video games. It'd be like, all right, let's talk about design. So that was great. I would say the thing I struggled with though was I did foundations. And foundations is it's a pretty light program. You can kind of make your own time through it. And when I moved to UX Academy, I was still working full time at a tech startup, and things were really busy. So I was working 45 hours. It was crazy. I don't recommend it. But on top of that, I was part time, which I thought I would be able to pull off, which is 20 hours a week. And I'd say about 3 months in, I was just so burned out because I couldn't even, I would work all week looking at a computer, and then I have to like hop on and do some really rigorous designs. Granted, it's what I want to do, but I realized my job was distracting from the thing I really wanted to do. So my advice too for anyone who's doing UX Academy is like really going to commit to this. It is a commitment. The work, the feedback. I've seen mentors call people out where they're not, and it's like, it doesn't look like you put as much work into this as you're saying you're putting into this. And that's, that's real feedback, and that's what would happen in a real job. So yeah, I in January of 2022 this year, I actually quit my job just to focus on UX Academy. And even full time, like a quarter of the way through it, I got done in like April, and it was intense. So yeah, that was my struggle, but worked out.
Yeah, yeah. I think you brought up a good point. Maybe not giving yourself enough credit, because I also think it's a skill to develop receiving critical feedback. Even if the person delivering it is good at balancing, the critical with the encouraging. It's
Mhm.
also, I think, a skill that students, have to work at a bit to get comfortable, receiving, and also being able to receive it in a way that you're encouraged, but also you've got some actionable things to work on. And yeah, that was really interesting to hear about. Also know Bob. Bob is great.
It was
So I
wonderful.
could
Yeah.
I could see why you had a great experience with Bob.
Yep.
We do have one question that I'm gonna go through everyone's questions, but I'm just sort of trying to order them so that we're not throwing all over the timeline here. But one of the questions we've got is, do you have any tips on how to balance working full time and doing the program? Would you recommend folks go all in and do it that way? Would you do the same? Would you make the same decision again in hindsight? What were your tips for maybe dealing with that burnout even?
Oh man, do I have good advice? No. um, it's tough. It's tough. I will say, my job before, I wasn't working 40 hours, and that's sort of why I took on that part time. It's not that I was still getting paid of like 40 hours a week, but I was probably working closer to 30, ish hours, which is reasonable. So I still had some bandwidth and some time. Um, I think it's for me where it was becoming a clear sign of, deciding one over the other is sort of what I was talking about before. As I was submitting designs that were like really clearly done half-heartedly, and I was getting feedback basically saying like, you should try to like design better, which is like, at that point it's like very clear what's happening. So managing burnout, I think it's just not pushing yourself to that point where you are completely exhausted constantly. And if you find yourself there, like I found myself there, it is one of those questions to ask yourself, like, if you view it as a time budget, what needs to change? And as for quitting your job and committing full time to Designlab, I'm definitely not going to recommend a yes or a no, but it worked for me because I had saved up money. I had just decided that a few months prior, so I had the financial whereabouts to do it.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to some tips from like an internal perspective, I think having a mentor, as uncomfortable as like getting that kind of feedback can be, having a mentor that's kind of holding you accountable, and not like relying on them to take responsibility for your success in the course, but wholeheartedly receiving that feedback that like, hey, you're not putting the effort you need to put in, trusting that your mentor is going to give you that feedback when you need it. And I also think it might not have been applicable in your circumstance, but for students that are finding themselves getting into that burnt out place, reaching out to our team to see what other resources we can help with, is also a really, really good way to approach that. So we've got a couple questions that we're just going to answer that are like related to the course itself. So someone asked, what is the hourly commitment for part-time use academy? So the hourly commitment is 20 hours per week. That is what the estimate is. You may find that in a particular week, based on the iterations you're doing or based on a particular assignment, you may spend more time, you may spend less time. That is the typical estimate. And then we've got another question that is, if you can switch tracks and if it's possible to speed up. So the answer is yes, you can switch once from either direction, so from full-time to part-time or vice versa. And that time you can work a little bit ahead on that part-time track if you wanted to. All right, so we've got a couple other questions here. So Elaine asks, how did you know that you wanted to get into web design versus solely focusing on UX?
Because I got a job offer for it.
made
uh,
the choice easy.
yeah. Well, I also have a little bit of like front end development skills as well. So um, I just want to get the designer title. So when the web designer role came up and they're like, "Hey, do you want to take it?" It's like, "Yeah, I do."
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So to talk a little bit more about like your portfolio building and how you went about building the capstone projects that went into your portfolio, what was your approach in choosing your portfolio projects, and did you feel like it was more important to focus on the idea or on the execution, or yeah, how did you go about that?
I would say both. Uh, I've got my flashy, cool projects, and then I've got my sort of deep cut UX projects too. For me, there's really two types of people I'm trying to appeal to on that website. Aside from myself, I need to like it too. That's important, and I do like it. But so there's going to be your recruiters who generally don't they've got a general knowledge of what good design looks like, but they're not gonna, at least in my experience, don't have that deep seated like designer knowledge of user research, low fidelity, the process, the through line you put in your work. So when they see flashy things, they're just like, cool, let's chat. I'm like, all right. And then I've got my more comprehensive UX research heavy projects as well. And those are the ones I generally send over to the designers for them to have a better understanding of like how I would design. So that would be basically how I built my portfolio. It's flashy and it's also technical and really just appealing to uh, the recruiters first and then the designers second.
Nice. I think that's a really interesting approach in a good way. What would you advise for students going into phase two? And for everyone listening, that's when you would be starting your capstone projects and start building that portfolio. What would you advise that someone focus on within the projects? And yeah, I mean, you mentioned which projects sort of helped you draw attention. But what was your thought process going into phase two and like gearing up for that?
Yeah. So when I worked with Bob, I think with those capstone projects, the recommendation is have like a web design, have a mobile design, and then have a um, like a software add-on or something along those lines. I
To
would
add a
say
feature.
yes, add a feature.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Yeah, don't worry. I know what a feature is. I just slipped my mind. Uh, I would say originally when I was working with Bob, I was actually really interested in getting into video game design. And so we actually pivoted all of the projects, sort of ignoring we considered having like a mobile device design, but generally a lot of that was to be around like, for me, it was, if anyone played Diablo 2 here, I played Diablo 2 a lot. The UI is atrocious. It is trying to navigate the spell section is a nightmare. So that was my first project. But I think what's important though is to make sure that the designs you're doing all kind of complement each other in a way, but are also meant to appeal to the type of work you're looking for. Um, so I didn't necessarily think I was going to become a web developer by any means, but I know that I wanted to be on the UI side more than anything. So a lot of my work is much more UI focused. There is extensive UX, but I'm really trying to show that like I can make a nice looking design while also making sure I understand the user research behind it. But I would say it was UI first, UX second for what I was doing. And that's the role I was trying to get. So
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And also, you mentioned it, the power of sort of speaking to your mentor about, what you're thinking about working on, and figuring out where you can make, those adjustments based on what you're trying to draw attention to in your portfolio.
yeah.
Um,
And
what was
I would
Oh, go
just
ahead.
quickly add, um, also make sure you want to do what you're doing too, because trying to force a capstone project, you're just going to lose steam real fast. They take a lot of work. So the thing that you're going to design, I'd say for me, it was important to be excited about it. And everything I did was really exciting. So I was recently been going to the gym, and I don't know if people use gym apps here, but they're all like, for me, they're like all super hyper masculine and like weird, sort of like tribe, gym culty, like 7 days a week, all day, every day. So I wanted to make something that was fun and like casual with the person who gives up on the gym like every other week. So, and that was exciting to me. So it was a fun thing to design for.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I feel like on the other side, apps I see that are for women are very like butterfly and like extra feminine. It's kind of hard to
Mhm.
find something, a little bit in between.
Yeah, yeah.
We've got a question that's relevant to something that you just mentioned, which is that you have some front end development skills. And JC wants to know if you have any recommendations for building out a front end web design skill set while you're also working through UX Academy. And they mentioned that they imagine it was really helpful in making your public facing web portfolio stand out.
Yeah. So I would say get a job where you're designing email templates and no one on the team knows HTML or CSS, and then be the one that basically has to learn it. Um, but in all honesty, it is a really useful skill to have. It is a really useful skill to have. It's really not that hard once you understand sort of like the basic concepts of like the language. It's designing things out is super simple, and it's just amazing how someone at my current role will give me something and be like, I don't know how to do this. Like there seems to be an issue with the code, and you can just simply go back there, like take two things out, and everyone is like, oh my God, you are like the most amazing person. And then just showered in praise. It's wonderful. So, um, but I don't know anything like that's you can just find on the internet. I'm sure there are things just to practice HTML and CSS, but I just encourage everyone to understand that there is a little bit of a learning curve, but all in all, they're not hard languages to understand. And once you get the flow of them, it's simple. I'm not a linear thinker by any nature, but it was pretty easy for me to comprehend. So
um, to kind of go a little bit more into your process, and then we'll get into the job search, and then what you're currently doing. What were some resources that you found yourself returning to frequently, even now, and any rules of thumb you might have for typesetting or for grids, just as an example, that help you sort of stay consistent?
I would say my rule of thumb is uh, what is it? Good artists create, great artists steal. I'm fully happy to be a designer and look around and just say, I like this thing. I'm going to put this into my design. Not plagiarizing, mind you, but like taking the influence and understanding like that works. And I'm going to use it for myself. I think as a rule of thumb, trying to come up with an original design every single time is, well, it's immensely satisfying when it comes to fruition. It is also a very time consuming process. So for me, a lot of my work was, especially in UX Academy, UX UI Academy, UX Academy. Um, it was going to the one site I'll recommend is awards with I think it's three W's, awards.com. And it's just website awards. And there you can just cruise, you can look through different industries, how they're making really cool sites, and go from there. And that's what I did a lot of the time, was just looking at other people's work, taking something and then sort of Frankensteining a lot of work I liked, and then putting it all into one Frankenstein. portfolio piece.
Yeah, I went ahead for everyone and linked awards.com, which I like to read is
Yeah.
awards.com. uh, um, last question before we get into like your job search and just, how things went once you graduated, but it's kind of still related. Designlab teaches a certain workflow. How much of that workflow has been relevant to you for the workplace? How have you had to adapt that workflow? And what pieces have you been able to apply or take or change?
A lot of the workflow I have from UX Academy, I still use. The tricky part is getting people on board with that process who are not designers, and speaking from a place of not like a personal place necessarily, or a mix of like a personal place, but also in a design thinking place to convey that taking your time on a design is important. Not taking your time, but just making sure that you do the work thoroughly is important. And so for working for Mayo, I actually laid out an entire plan, which you do in UX Academy. It was immediately met with just like this, let's just cut to stage 3 where you're doing, product testing, user testing. And, my first reaction was like, well, that's impossible if there's no product. But I think though, with the process for me, what was important was to being able to get buy-in from the people who are essentially going to talk to other people who are going to speculate on your process. So a lot of the process I learned, I still use today. The thing I had to learn was how to convey it in an objective and personal manner.
Nice. That is nice to hear. That some of it's still applicable. What would you have in any other circumstance felt to like push back against that? Like, hey, let's jump to this phase. And I guess, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think are maybe the benefits of either of those things, of having to jump maybe further into a phase, or being able to push for going through the work in a more detailed way?
Yeah. So with things like this, again, just like feedback, it's best not to make it personal. And it's best not to say, oh, I can't do that, because it just makes it look like you're reluctant or you're incapable. So what I always do is I present options. So we're saying, okay, we're going to skip low fidelity testing, and we're going to skip user interviews and just go straight to product testing. I would say we can totally do that. I can create a product. There's a risk that it may not be as intuitive as we think it is. And we may have to do a lot of redesigns after the fact. And if they're okay with that, that's fine. I'll design the best I can, but they know the risks. And that was what I said originally to skipping user interviews for one project we're working on, is that exact thing. And they said, well, you know what? It sounds important, so we should probably do it. It's like, yeah, it's a little
Nice,
yeah.
nice. So to get into that job search, how long did it take you after graduating to find that first job? And what was that job search process like?
It took years. No, so I started looking for work in May, and I would say by July, I got an offer to start working in August. So like 3 months ish, I would say. I would say the first month I was not applying for jobs very well, and I was way overconfident in my ability to like interview. And then I started going to design interviews and being like, wow, I'm really not as great as I thought it was. So recalibrated.
What, if you're comfortable, can you give an example of what that looked like? What did going into confident, what made you realize that you maybe weren't should be as confident as you were at the time?
Yeah. So I did an interview where it was a second round interview, and it was with a designer, and he asked me, he's like, so we're going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about the Slack and email. We're going to talk about why I'm going to argue for email and you're going to argue for Slack. And like, granted, I hadn't used Slack in like 7 months, so I was like a little unfamiliar or just like, yeah, rusty.
Out of practice, right?
Yeah. But, I should have been able to, I just should have been more prepared in the sense of how to talk design with a designer. And I knew it was coming and I was like, oh, I'm just like naturally good at design. So it's going to totally work out. And it totally didn't work out. So that definitely knocked me down a peg. I was like, okay, it's time to like, really prepare for these interviews, understand the background of the company, and also just work on interviewing as well.
So you just segued perfectly into Lucy's question, which is, what was your best tip for the search, and what did that interview preparation look like? How were you getting prepared once you realized you needed to prepare more?
Yeah, so the best tip for job searching I have is just be in the right place at the right time. Totally works out. I think, again, like if you're coming from like a bartender background, coming from service or like construction, something you don't feel like is like a natural pivot. Again, I think it's just really important to tailor what you're doing, your resume, to at least show design experience, even where there is none, because if that makes up a big part of, or if a recruiter sees construction and it's like you've put windows into a building, great, but that's nothing to do with design, be generally overlooked. And so okay, the best tip, what was the other question?
Your interview prep.
Oh, yeah.
What did it look like? What went into that?
My interview prep. Yeah, so it was a lot of, if you're not enthusiastic about the product that you're going to get hired for, it is read so fast. So make sure you understand. For me, I had to understand what I was interviewing for. So for Mayo Clinic, I was getting hired to the Center of Digital Health, which is basically taking healthcare online. So you can like interview the doctors, and it creates accessibility to places that may not have a hospital for 30, 40, 50, 60 miles. And that's fantastic. And that enthusiasm alone like carried a lot of the conversation to say, I'm excited to work for a place like this, an opportunity like this, and accessibility is like a really important thing to me. And having that enthusiasm for the place that you're interviewing is crucial, because it is so easily read if you don't have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I've definitely had some interviews just in my own life that you're giving me some flashbacks to, of just not being prepared. Do
Yep.
you have any resources that you can share, or any just like tips for the way you went about getting ready, or even things that folks could expect regularly in an interview that you experienced along the way?
Yeah. So interview prep for me was, resource I would recommend is a mirror, just seeing how you talk and seeing how you look. But also having just sort of stock questions. And again, this is just for me in particular. That's maybe different for everybody, but I would basically take that answer it, and then just basically reiterate the same answer, just keep fixing it until I felt like I had a comfortable place that I could speak confidently about answering said question. So talking out loud is a really big help. And then the third question was,
What I think you covered them all. I think you got them
oh,
all.
what do you expect in an interview?
Yes,
That's it.
things that you might see come up.
Yeah. Things that you might see coming. So I think one thing that I didn't see in UX Academy that I get a lot is, how do you communicate design to, and it may be in UX Academy, but how do you communicate design to people who don't necessarily understand it, or can be in fact like don't really care for it. Like, how do you talk to someone in sales who thinks time is money, that you're trying to get more time? And so being able to have experience sort of working departmentally, or simply presenting design in a positive nature to people who don't necessarily understand design is huge, because you can communicate design to another designer easily, but how do you communicate it to like a customer representative who's has their input? So yeah, I would say that came up quite a bit.
Did you ever have to do a design challenge at any point in your interview processes?
Yes, unfortunately, I'm fairly anti-design challenge. I have done quite a few. Um, I will say, as another tip, be careful for these tech startups. I've gotten tech startups that have been like, redesign our entire interface for web and mobile, and that's a really sketchy design question. And so my response was like, well, what's the time budget? And they're like, oh, it should take like 3 hours. And so I gave them like, this is what 3 hours of work looks like. And I made a sketch in my notebook after I made a plan. Like, that's all you get. So yeah, be pretty careful if a design challenge seems like they're asking far more than it should be. Yeah.
We just got a comment from Elaine, which I think is a good point. If a design challenge is directly about their product, red flag.
Yes. Yep.
Not a good sign.
Agreed.
You mentioned, getting into certain interviews and realizing that you needed to prep more, that you were maybe going in too confident. How did you deal with getting a rejection, or the job search can be exhausting sometimes. So how did you deal with those moments of maybe self-doubt or just getting rejected?
Screaming in a pillow like everyone else does. No, rejection, failure, it's all part of the process. I think it's some rejections I welcomed, because I honestly didn't even want to work for some of these companies. But some rejections I took more personally than I should have. And I think it's really important to understand that those rejections are never personal. They're usually entirely self-driven by the company's decision and have nothing to do with you as a designer or as a person. And for me, I would follow up and just say, hey, I appreciate you guys taking the time. It was nice to hear about how you guys do whatever you do. What was your feedback? What feedback do you have? Or no feedback. I'm just curious about why I wasn't up to par for the position. So, and sometimes you get some pretty good answers. Sometimes you get some pretty lame answers, but all in all, that it is helpful to have some transparency on, why what happened.
Yeah, I think I was talking to someone recently about just job search, and we were having a conversation about when you think about the job search, and this can be difficult because when you finish a boot camp, because you're just anxious to get into the field, and it's exhausting to apply to jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it as sort of the practice that leads up to you being ready for the job you are going to get, I think it makes it a little bit easier to go in to each experience without like taking it so personally, because you're still getting the interview practice, or even if it's on the other side, you're getting experience seeing a red flag. You're getting experience seeing things that and can identify, or things you don't want to look for, as you go through the job search.
Yep.
So you got the job. Tell us a little bit about what your day-to-day is looking like, and what skills are you using now in your work?
Yeah. So the day-to-day, so I mainly work on UI stuff. I do some UX, not right now. I did a lot of UX last month, but a lot of what I do is working with people who have, so I work at Mayo Clinic in the Center of Digital Health. There's a lot of different departments in there, anything from AI education to community management, et cetera, et cetera. All these guys have different sites on the intranet somewhere. And so I work with a ton of different people who are saying, we're looking to, and a lot of what's given to me is pretty vague. And that's part of being a designer, is taking vague direction and make it concrete. That's something you can both agree and understand. And so they'll say, oh, I want this to be more community oriented. And so basically to work with them to figure out, what does community oriented look like to you, and how do we design this into the website page or the website intranet site.
Right. So one of the questions we have is your current role different every day? Is it changing frequently? You mentioned like last month you were working more in UX. What are the deadlines like where you're working? Yeah.
So I would say that's part of why I want to do design, because it is quite the variety. I'm working with a lot of different people. I talk to maybe 15 different people every week, all different departments. And the variety is really interesting. It's definitely a trial in active listening. And so, but yeah, the variety is there, and that's a big reason why I want to do this work, is because it's not the same day to day that I've had in the past. So
We got another question from Jed. It was actually the first question, and I was like, "Hold on, Jed, we're coming back." At your current company, do you advocate for the need for junior product designers within the design team, and how many junior designer positions are currently like on your team or offered at your company?
no and zero. I'm the only web designer on the team, and I'm just like the first person there. I don't right now because I'm
It's
new.
early, right?
But so, as I was sort of saying before, with when someone makes something a more priority, you give sort of like, you weigh the risks and the successes of that. And when I get to a point where I have so much work that I keep on saying like, well, we can prioritize this project, but this project's going to go down. This project may lose quality. I'd say that's the point to start mentioning, like, maybe we need another person on here who can take on some like design tasks that are not immensely complicated, but still take design thinking to go about them. So to just reiterate the answer, no, I don't. There's zero positions right now, but if there was too much work I would definitely start advocating for it.
Nice. We got some questions that have come in. So I'm gonna like combine these two because I think they're similar. They've got similar goals, I think. So one of the questions is, let me find it here. So specifically working in healthcare, what is that like, and what do you see? Do you see yourself staying in that area, or just what do you see as your next steps in terms of advancement down the road in the future?
You would think that like I've got some, going from working in a marketing agency to working in a tech startup to working in healthcare, the content changes and the demographics change, but the design work generally stays the same. And so I haven't felt like I've really had a huge tone shift in what I've done. If I was still in marketing, definitely, because that's a different story entirely. But with design, not so much. The same principles still apply. The same work still goes into it. It's just, you know, just understanding the audience that you're engaging with. Yeah.
So I compare, I think, a couple of other these questions together. What's it like being the sole designer at the company? Have you found that you've needed more support? And maybe these are tied, so I'm going to pair this question. being so new, do you feel like you're dealing with imposter syndrome at any point? And what is your approach to dealing with it if you do feel that?
So being the only designer, so I'll do the only designer first and then imposter syndrome second. Being the only designer, there's ebbs and flows to my work. It can really get piled on and I can get too much work. And it's important for me to have a manager that I can reach out and say, okay, we need to prioritize things. What's going to go up front? What's going to go behind? But honestly, it hasn't been that bad. I kind of prefer being like the sole person. So it really works out for me. And as for imposter syndrome, it's there until you don't really have the capacity to have it anymore. And you're like, I can have imposter syndrome and try to design this, or I can just design this thing, just push through it. And that's what happened to me is I basically had to stop saying like, oh, I'm like a faux designer. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm a designer. They need me to be a designer. I'm going to be a designer. I'm just going to get this done. So for me, just dealing with imposter syndrome was simply for me, just after a while, it's like, this is an energy drain that's contributing nothing to what I'm doing. It's not making me a better designer by any way other than being annoying.
I love that. I also feel like maybe it lends itself that you're the sole designer, because if you're not the designer, there is no designer.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right?
Yep. And
You have to be it.
I have to. I like. There's no choice. I was like, yeah. Well, there was a choice. I could have quit, but I should say
No
there
quitter.
wasn't. It was, I essentially got a huge project given to me, and I was like, okay, you need to have this like really complex resource website done in the next 2 months, and I was like, oh my god, this is insane. I just had to be the designer that they wanted me to be. And I don't like letting people down. So that was really my fuel, was to be like, I'm not going to let you guys down and persevere.
Right. And power through.
Yeah.
So we got a question about age. And what are your thoughts or tips for older people that are coming into the industry? And yeah, what are your thoughts on just age and this industry?
I feel like this lends itself to imposter syndrome, is that I've worked with super young designers who are terrible at design, and I've worked with older designers who are in a junior position who clearly know what they're doing. I think even with titles, with age, with experience, if you're just natural, if you're good at design and you're a good worker, that's really all that matters. And I can't speak for everyone, because there are people who do discriminate, which is a tragedy, but I can speak for myself, and that is, again, age, even title. I've seen senior designers with like terrible feedback, and I've seen junior designers make things that blown me away. It just matters if you're a good designer and you work.
I think it also lends itself to what you were talking about earlier about how your previous experience contributes to you as a designer.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, UX UI is all about accessibility, and
Yep.
it doesn't make sense that all of our designers would or should be of any age, in order to make the best products. And like you said, there's definitely discrimination, but I also think companies and teams that understand that as the principle of UX design are also aware of the importance of diverse teams.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think too, like, sort of tying back to the interview process, if you're enthusiastic both about the product you're interviewing for and the work you do, that makes up like more than half of who you are and how interesting you can be. And I've definitely recommended hiring people who were less experienced because they seemed like they cared more. And having someone
Right.
who's 4 years deep, or who's just like, oh yeah, this is just like a job and I just get through designs and that's whatever. It's like, I don't want to work with you, man. That's not
Right.
fun. You sound like a demo.
All right. I think we got a couple minutes left. So we've got another question here, which is, Have you found that benefits and perks, or the packages that you find as benefits and perks as a designer, are wildly different across, different roles or different industries?
Maybe. I don't know. You definitely get paid well, so that's cool. As for benefits, that I think it's not even a designer thing. I think it's simply just the company. You can tell if a company cares versus cares about their employees by the benefits that they offer. And they should be,
Right.
that should absolutely be part of the interview process, is when they're like,
Yes.
do you have any questions for me? It's like, yeah, how do you treat your employees and how do you like empower people?
Right.
And some of those jobs where I'm like, how do you like empower your employees to learn more? And they're like, well, we love seeing people search for things on Google. It's like, okay, well, that's like, oh, thanks.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a great interview tip as well, is that you're interviewing as much as you're being interviewed at
Yeah.
that point in the process. So I'm going to do my last question, and then we'll say our goodbyes, which is just, what has your experience been? So it sounds like you're web designing, but it sounds like occasionally you're using UX and you're using parts of the process. How have you found that you've been able to keep your skills sharp when your role is calling for very specific, like, pieces of the puzzle? And if you have any tips on
How do I keep my skills?
that.
Oh man, I don't. I mean, I do a lot of design, like day in, day out. So
You feel pretty sharp.
I mean, it's yeah, but like in certain areas,
Right.
like I would say right now, my user interface designing, my front end designing is like super great. I would not say that my research is as good. So, um, but I'm also like, I do this stuff 40 hours a week anyways, and it'd be really hard for me to like pick up a project and be like,
Of
let's start,
course.
you know, interviewing people on the street about how they interact with their phones. But I will say you can also parallel that, because I work for a radio station in town too, doing photography and musician interviews. So that's a great way to like, it doesn't necessarily have to be connected to
Directly.
design. Yeah, you can find the parallels in making designs, and even that might be rearranging furniture, making sure you have the right padding in your living room.
Right. Right. Um, All right. Well, I think we've come in almost exactly at an hour. So first, thanks to you, Oliver,
Of
for
course.
being here, for answering all of these wonderful questions from everyone in the chat.
Thank you for
Um,
having me, and thank you for everyone for being here today too. It's I can't see you all, but I see the number 77 down there. So
and it's a very active chat, so everyone
hell
is
yeah.
contributing here, and so thanks to everyone in the chat that's here as well. It was great having you all. This is recorded, it'll be up on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, and you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is at Designlab, and Twitter is at Try Designlab. Follow those so that you can stay up to date. So when we do more of these alumni spotlights, or just events in general, that you can find out about them, as well as, like, student specific events and product updates. We love connecting with y'all. So it's great having y'all here. It's been great talking to you, Oliver, and have a wonderful rest of your night or day or whatever time it is, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.